Many of you have asked us to check on various areas around the island. There are more than 70 municipalities here in Puerto Rico, and it's been impossible for us to reach every one of them. I would say at this point we've reached more than 20, and we continue to go out. Today my colleague Sean Herbert was able to do something we've been trying to do since we got here, which was respond to a message. You guys have been flooding me with messages. I'm averaging about 100 a minute at last check, and I'm sorry I have not been able to personally respond. But there was one email that caught our attention that talked about bodies that were floating and caskets that had been unearthed in a really dire situation in Lares. And so Sean went out there today with one of our colleagues from Washington, D.C., and I just wanted to bring him in to kind of give you just a sense of what he saw. First of all, about the bodies and the caskets, but what else he saw is he went to Lares, which is on the western side of the island, going toward Aguadilla. So Sean, tell us what you saw.
Well, first of all, just being able to basically get a first-hand account and be able to try and corroborate some of these testimonies that we're getting from email is always critical as a journalist, right? So we went to Lares and we found the cemetery, and sure enough it's on a hill, and it rolls down towards where the river had indeed outstretched its banks and was raging at one point. But indeed there were no coffins flying, there were no floating in the river. There were no bodies that were in the water. There was no concern by officials there about epidemics or disease of any kind from that sort of scenario. And there was actually a police officer at a checkpoint at the cemetery, essentially turning away all of the loved ones, family members who were concerned about their buried relatives and whether or not that rumor was true. And so one of the things that really struck me, David, is how in the end of the day, this is one of those storms where not having communications, not having power, access to cell phones, Facebook, and internet has really allowed gossip and these types of stories to get rampant and run out of, basically get out of control. And so it's one of those good stories where you actually find out that the rumors weren't true, and at the end of the day, everything turned out to be not nearly as bad as what we thought in Lares.
And the reason I wanted Sean to bring that up is because when I went to, a lot of you have reached out to me and said there's no way that the death toll here in Puerto Rico could be 16. It's impossible. And officials have said we believe it's going to go higher. But the Secretary of Public Safety said to me, listen, I'm concerned that rumor is really getting in the way of us finding out the truth. And listen, when you guys come to us with something, trust me, we look into it, we read into it. But when we call the officials and they say it's rumor, the only thing we can do beyond talking to them is go to put some eyes on it ourselves. And that's what Sean did today. And when he came back, he was like, no caskets floating, no bodies floating. In fact, didn't you say there was a police officer who was at that cemetery turning people away?
Strictly there to turn back the people who were coming there, essentially hearing the gossip, hearing the rumor, and wanting to see for themselves whether or not their relatives were one of the unfortunate ones where their casket might be floating downriver and contaminating the water supply. In the end, none of it was true.
Tell me some of the rest of what you saw just driving around.
Well, we drove to Utuado, which was one of the hardest hit. The river, certainly, this is a valley that leads towards the dam that was such a threat.
And that's the Oaxaca Dam.
About 10 days ago. And really what we saw was the first real presence of power lines being restored, linemen working with the power companies and the local municipality there. It's a town of 37,000. It's actually the third largest suburban area in all of the island. And but they certainly, as there's progress, they also are relying more and more on themselves. They're not going to wait for handout. They're not waiting for assistance. They had basically at the top of the valley set up an entire water system, and the entire community was getting fresh water from a spring. I can't tell you whether or not there was any contamination, but certainly they're using it to boil if they can at home with firewood. They were using it to wash off their cars, simple things, but also washing clothes. One gentleman had actually, talk about resourcefulness, had actually had to put a wash machine on the back of the pickup truck, had a generator running the wash machine, and then using all the water coming off of the mountain spring to actually do laundry. And many others were doing it by hand, more traditional way. But there are also people just coming with containers as small as a small bottle and as large as like a swimming pool. And there, obviously, that water is so vital to life, right? And so the resourcefulness was really impressive. But at the same time, I'll also say only one grocery store for 37,000 people that was open.
What
And
did you find in that grocery store?
they actually had just been restocked, so they actually had delivery of groceries, lots of canned goods. But guess what? Out of bread instantly. Even though they had rationing for bread, milk, and water, those shelves in that area were completely empty.
Yeah.
So they can't keep up with demand.
Yeah. So, and I'll also, just another update as we drove around San Juan tonight, the mall, what I was told was the biggest mall in San Juan was open, and the parking lot was full of cars. And in fact, outside in San Juan right now, you hear music on the street. People are eating at a little cafe restaurant that has tables outside. So there is a restoration of the quality of life that people were used to prior to the hurricane, but it cannot be underestimated that tonight there is still an emergency situation in many parts of the island. So thank you, Sean. I just wanted to share with you guys more of what we're seeing 11 days after the storm made landfall.